Ori and the Blind Forest is everything you'd want from a modern Metroidvania game. Good story, wonderful graphics, and gameplay as smooth as silk. Absolutely wonderful. The first thing you'll notice is just how good the game looks and sounds. The story starts with a cutscene. Not a long one, just enough to set the scene. And then the gameplay kicks in and you realize that everything in this game will maintain those beautiful graphics and cutscene level realism. What an absolute treasure. The game starts with you playing as the slow, pudgy Naru for a bit, until for story-related reasons you switch to playing as the quick and bouncy titular character, Ori. I wanted to specifically mention this switch between characters because their movements are so different from each other that when you do start playing as Ori, his movements seem all the more quick and responsive. You could argue that none of this pre-game setup was necessary and everything could have just been stuffed into a longer cutscene, but honestly this was a brilliant way of setting up the mood and feeling of speed for the entire game. And speed is an important factor in this game. Not only are your reaction skills put to the test on the regular, but the game also tasks you with outrunning obstacles instead of taking on classical bosses. Alright, so we've established that the game feels good to play, but how does it sound and how does it look? It is absolutely phenomenal in both cases. One of the game's claims to fame is that absolutely each visual asset is entirely unique. You will never come across the same piece of log, the same mushroom, the same stone anywhere else in the game. Because everything is so stylized, because platforms don't look like platforms, it truly feels like you're running through a forest, jumping over actual fallen trees, swamps, and ravines. It's just so visually unique, so organic. Since the game loads the entire map at once, there are no loading screens and movement from one area to another is done gradually through changes to the surrounding landscape and lighting. Although the game has you traveling around the map in a mostly linear fashion, there are only a few areas that become permanently sealed off for story-related reasons. So for those players that like exploring, hunting for secrets, and backtracking for power-ups, Ori is absolutely perfect in that it lets you do just that over and over again. The sound design for the game is also very fitting. A lot of flute and wind instruments that match very well with the forest setting. Compared to other games, I'd say the soundtrack is more complementary and focuses on setting and keeping the mood in a particular area rather than functioning like a playlist. Because the story takes place in a forest, there are a lot of sound effects that were added, creaking trees, whooshing grass, etc. If the soundtrack wasn't as light in tone as it was, these details would have been effectively lost. I think the game is very impressive for presenting an OST that truly feels like part of the world and makes room for natural noises. The user interface is also very sleek in design. Because the game loads all together, it is extremely important that a player can easily figure out where they are and where they need to go. Luckily, the developers made sure that the map is easily accessible and shows all explored areas at once, as well as the general direction of the goal. So if you do find yourself lost from all the backtracking for whatever reason, putting yourself back on the correct game path is pretty easy. I also like that the skill tree is less of a tree and more like a logical progression of strength. It's also nice that it's basically optional and mandatory skills are discovered through the story. So if you are sure that you're good enough, you are more than welcome to complete the game without relying on these particular upgrades. However, I do think that the developers made a slight error when developing the size of the skill tree and how the game allows you to skill up. In the game, you have a skill meter that slowly fills up with every enemy you kill. Additionally, there are skill point orbs that can be found throughout the game that will give you a whole ability point you can use. Different skills require a different number of skill points, the most expensive ones requiring 3. The problem is, as you skill up naturally through gameplay, you get better and faster at traveling, and so it becomes easier and more convenient to simply avoid fighting. Additionally, the game doesn't engage in throwing mobs of monsters at you. They generally function more as additional obstacles as you platform around. As such, defeating enough enemies to max out the tree doesn't happen naturally through story progression. You have to set aside time to grind if you want that achievement. In my case, I ran into this problem twice, during my first playthrough when I took my sweet time killing everything that moved, and in my second when I focused more on the collectibles. There was a 6-hour playtime difference between the two, and I still found myself finishing the game in pretty much the same place on the skill tree. Another thing that stood out to me is the game's lack of imagination when it came to enemies. The game also doesn't have bosses, but that is still well substituted by challenging obstacle course-like areas that cap off each section. But when it comes to the enemies, you're pretty much limited to the standard lineup. Ones that run at you, ones that jump at you, ones that fly at you, ones that shoot at you, ones that pop out of the ground and shoot at you, piranhas, and laser beams. The piranhas and laser beams are unique to a few specific locations, but all the others get slightly recolored for each area and start shooting more projectiles at a time. Coupled with the fact that starting mid-game, one particular ability literally lets you latch on and jump from projectiles, the enemies in this game become absolute pushovers towards the end. I guess this makes the game pretty unique in this area and might even attract players that simply want to jump around instead of facing enemies, but I was personally a bit disappointed. I kind of think that the unique visual assets ate through the studio's creative budget faster than what was expected, and that's why the enemies are so uninspired. Still, this is something that will be perceived as a serious flaw only by some. This will barely, if at all, impact your experience playing the game. Last on my list of complaints, I have to admit that the story did leave me feeling a bit unfulfilled, in the same areas that Yahtzee Zero Punctuation pointed out. That said, this does mean that everyone with a shred of soul will be left quite satisfied by the story. In conclusion, I'd recommend Ori and the Blind Forest to just about everyone. Regardless of how one might feel about indie games, the style and feel of this game is undoubtedly superb. With its relatively short playtime, the game's direct story and fluid controls make this game accessible to players of all levels. Simply, the game is fun to play and will appeal to anyone that plays games at all.